The morning sun poured through the terminal windows, streaking golden light across rows of travelers rushing to board Flight 227 from Dallas to Washington. Amid the blur of businessmen juggling coffee cups and families herding sleepy children, one woman moved with quiet purpose, her steps steady and her expression unreadable. Her boarding pass read Seat 12F, window side, mid-cabin, an unremarkable place for an unremarkable traveler, or so it seemed. She wore simple jeans, a fitted navy jacket, and carried a small leather duffel, nothing about her suggesting fame or importance. Yet there was something about the way she carried herself, an economy of motion, a stillness in her eyes, that hinted at depths hidden far below the surface. Her name was Ava Mitchell, and to those around her she appeared to be just another passenger on a routine flight. But a few thousand feet above, two F-22 Raptors patrolled the skies on a separate mission, their pilots oblivious that the woman who had once commanded their kindred spirits now sat quietly among civilians. Sipping coffee and reading a worn paperback novel, Ava slid into her seat in row 12, nodding politely to the middle-aged man beside her, a chatty salesman who immediately began discussing turbulence and business trips. She smiled, replying in brief sentences that revealed nothing of her past. The hum of boarding announcements and luggage clattering overhead filled the cabin as passengers settled. Attendants moved briskly through aisles, and the captain's voice came over the intercom with practiced calm. Outside, the tarmac shimmered in the sunlight, engines spooling with power. Ava glanced out the window as the jet taxied, her eyes narrowing slightly, not from fear or impatience but from habit, the instinctive assessment of angles, distances, wind direction. It was muscle memory born from years in the cockpit, from hundreds of missions across hostile skies where precision and composure meant survival. Those memories were buried now, filed away in a part of her mind she rarely visited, not because she regretted them but because she'd chosen peace after decades of duty. As the plane lifted off, climbing steadily through layers of cloud, Ava leaned back and closed her eyes, letting the vibration of the engines lull her into stillness. The chatter around her faded into white noise, but her mind, trained to scan and analyze, never fully rested. Old instincts stirred with each subtle shift in altitude, each variation in sound, and when the captain mentioned mild turbulence ahead, her eyes flicked open, assessing, calculating unconsciously. The man beside her chuckled nervously, muttering something about not liking bumpy rides, and she smiled softly, replying, "You'll be fine. These aircraft can handle far worse." Her tone carried quiet authority, enough that he looked at her curiously. "You sound like you know planes." Ava's lips curved faintly. "I used to fly." She didn't elaborate and he didn't press, assuming she meant small private planes. But as clouds parted and sunlight illuminated the endless blue horizon, her gaze lingered, a flicker of nostalgia passing through her features. The longing for the stick in her hands, the rush of acceleration, the thunderous roar of engines pushing her past the sound barrier. She had once lived for those moments, commanding squadrons of fighter jets, her voice calm and commanding over radio channels as she led formations through combat exercises and real missions alike. She had been a legend among her peers, call sign Valkyrie, one of the Air Force's most respected fighter commanders, until she had chosen to leave it all behind after a mission that had tested not just her skills, but her soul. The decision had earned her both admiration and confusion within the ranks, but Ava knew she needed a life away from constant danger, a life that allowed her to breathe without listening for radar pings or missile locks. Now, years later, she found herself on a civilian flight, headed to Washington to speak at a Veterans Foundation event. Though few aboard knew who she was, to them she was simply the woman in seat 12F, polite, reserved, and seemingly ordinary. But fate, as it often does, had a way of reminding even the quietest souls that destiny doesn't fade. It merely waits. 2 hours into the flight, as the aircraft cruised high above the Appalachian ridges, the captain's calm voice broke through the intercom once more, announcing an unexpected change. Air traffic control had rerouted their flight path due to military exercises nearby. Most passengers barely noticed, continuing their conversations or napping. But Ava's eyes snapped to the window, her pulse quickening slightly as she spotted contrails, long, thin streaks slicing through the sky miles away. Her trained eyes recognized the pattern instantly, tactical formation. It was unmistakable. Her fingers tightened around her armrest, not from fear, but from instinct. The salesman beside her followed her gaze. Wow, look at those jets. Must be Air Force training, huh? She nodded faintly. Though her expression had shifted from calm to calculating, she could tell by the vapor trails, by the spacing, even by the faint shimmer of metal. Those were F-22 Raptors, the newest generation, agile, lethal, elegant, the very kind she once commanded. She watched as they banked, gleaming like silver arrows against the sunlight, unaware that the woman who had once directed their predecessors from the skies now watched from a passenger seat. Yet something about their movement caught her attention, a subtle pattern in their maneuvering that only a trained pilot could notice. They weren't just patrolling. They were adjusting position, aligning in response to an unidentified object in their airspace. Ava's pulse steadied, her brain slipping seamlessly back into military awareness. Her hands itched for controls that weren't there. She glanced toward the cockpit door, debating internally whether to inform the crew. But before she could move, the radio crackled faintly through the intercom, a burst of static that momentarily interrupted the captain's briefing. Passengers barely reacted, assuming it was interference, but Ava caught a familiar tone hidden beneath the noise. Encrypted Air Force radio chatter bleeding through the frequency. Her mind translated instinctively, picking up code phrases she hadn't heard in years. She froze, her heart pounding, and whispered under her breath, "That can't be right." The man beside her gave a puzzled look, but she didn't respond. Her focus was locked on the sky outside, where the two fighter jets now flanked their plane at a distance, their wings shimmering in the sunlight. The air inside the cabin thickened with tension only she could feel. Something was happening, something she was trained to understand, and whether she liked it or not, the part of her she'd tried to leave behind was awakening once again. The hum of the engines filled the air, a steady rhythm masking the rising tension that only one passenger could sense. Ava Mitchell's calm demeanor barely concealed the storm that brewed beneath her surface. She leaned slightly toward the window of seat 12F, eyes tracking the faint silver shapes of the two F-22 Raptors now pacing the commercial aircraft. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like an escort or simple airspace monitoring, but to her it was a tactical positioning maneuver. Precise, deliberate, and defensive. Something wasn't right. Ava's instincts sharpened. Years of training surged to the surface, every small vibration, every distant sound being analyzed by her subconscious mind. The salesman beside her was still rambling about his company's new product line, but she wasn't listening anymore. She was tuned into something else, the rhythm of the sky, the silent language of fighter pilots. Her body tensed as she noticed a slight dip in the nose of one jet, followed by a banking move. That was a signal. A visual command sequence, a maneuver used during mid-air coordination. She had used it herself countless times. The cabin lights flickered briefly, the aircraft adjusting altitude slightly as the captain's voice returned to the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently at 34,000 feet. You might notice a couple of Air Force jets in the distance. They're part of a training exercise in the area. Nothing to be concerned about." Passengers murmured in mild interest, some craning their necks to see through tiny oval windows. But Ava knew better. There was no way a training mission would be positioned that close to a commercial airliner without explicit coordination. Something far more serious was unfolding. Her gaze narrowed, tracking the formation's subtle shift. A third contrail appeared faintly above the others, descending fast, a high-speed interception. Her chest tightened. That meant a potential airspace violation had been detected. She glanced toward the cockpit door again, a battle waging in her mind. She was no longer in uniform, no longer Valkyrie, the squadron commander who once led these skies. Yet the call of duty, that deep, unyielding instinct, was impossible to silence. Her fingers drummed lightly on the tray table as she weighed her next move. The captain's voice crackled again, this time less steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're being advised to hold our current altitude. Air traffic control has requested we remain steady until further notice." His tone was calm, but Ava caught the tension underneath. She could hear it, that subtle strain in the voice of a man receiving instructions beyond his control. Then it happened. A faint click from the cabin speakers and interference again. But this time Ava caught the distinct hum of encrypted communication bleeding through. It was a code frequency she knew by heart. Her pulse spiked as she made out fragments of a radio exchange. "Raptor 1, visual confirmed. Civilian aircraft maintaining course. Possible signal interference detected. Stand by for verification. Ava's heart pounded. Verification? That word triggered something deep inside her. A protocol reserved for identifying unknown or high-risk aircraft. Her gaze darted outside again. The lead F-22 had adjusted its wings, banking closer. She could almost see the pilot's helmet glinting in the sunlight. Her breath caught as the fighter dipped slightly, signaling something. It wasn't aggression. It was a question, a pilot-to-pilot inquiry. And she knew exactly what it was asking. Identify yourself. For a long moment, Ava sat frozen. Then her old training took over. Without thinking, she whispered the familiar cadence under her breath, the language of airspace recognition codes. But no one could hear her. She needed a radio, a frequency, something to transmit. Her mind raced. Commercial cockpits used open radio lines to communicate with air traffic control. If she could just reach the captain. She unbuckled her seatbelt, earning a worried look from the flight attendant who hurried over. "Ma'am, please stay seated. We're in restricted airspace. It's for your safety." Ava met her eyes, calm but firm. "I need to speak with the captain now." The attendant hesitated. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but..." "Listen," Ava interrupted, her voice low but commanding, the kind of tone that brooked no argument. "Tell your captain that Colonel Ava Mitchell, United States Air Force, needs 2 minutes of his time. Tell him it's regarding the F-22s off his wing." The attendant blinked, visibly startled. "Colonel?" "Yes," Ava said, her tone steady, her eyes sharp. "And tell him my call sign is Valkyrie." The attendant stared at her, uncertain whether to believe the woman in jeans and a jacket could possibly be who she claimed. But something in Ava's tone, the quiet authority in her posture, pushed her to move. She hurried toward the cockpit. Minutes passed like hours. The passengers looked around nervously, sensing something wasn't quite right. Then the cockpit door opened and the captain himself stepped out. A tall man in his 40s, his expression tense. "Colonel Mitchell?" he asked quietly. Ava stood, nodding. "Yes, you're picking up military chatter, aren't you?" He hesitated, then nodded. "We are. They're requesting verification codes. They think our transponder might be spoofed. We can't reach air traffic control properly. Something's jamming the channel." Ava exhaled slowly. "You're in restricted airspace near an active exercise. Those F-22s think you might be a threat. They're looking for an identification signal, but the interference is masking yours." The captain's jaw tightened. "So what do we do?" "Let me talk to them," she said simply. He blinked. "You can do that?" She gave a faint smile. "Let's just say I've spoken to Raptors before." Within moments, Ava was in the cockpit, slipping effortlessly back into the mindset she thought she'd left behind. The pilots looked at her, uncertain, but the captain nodded for them to let her through. She leaned over the radio panel, scanning frequencies. Her hands moved with precision, tuning into the military band she knew by heart. The moment she spoke, her voice was calm, confident, and utterly professional. "This is Colonel Ava Mitchell, United States Air Force, call sign Valkyrie. To Raptor 1 and 2, break formation and hold distance. Civilian aircraft Flight 227 is verified friendly. Repeat, verified friendly." For several seconds there was silence, dead air. Then a burst of static crackled through, followed by a stunned voice. "Valkyrie? Say again." "Did you say Valkyrie?" Ava smiled faintly. "Affirmative, Raptor 1. It's been a while." Inside the cockpit of one of the Raptors, a young pilot stared in disbelief. The name Valkyrie was legendary in their world, the woman who had once trained some of the best fighter commanders alive. Her tactics were still studied in simulation modules. She was a myth, a voice they had only heard about in stories, and now somehow she was on a passenger plane beneath them. "Ma'am," the pilot stammered over the radio. This is Lieutenant James Reeve, Raptor 1. "It's an honor, ma'am." "We didn't know you were on board." Ava's tone softened. "No need for formalities, Lieutenant. Just doing what needs to be done. You've got signal interference in your vector. Check frequency channel 62.3 for spoofing. I can see your pattern. You're getting false altitude data." The young pilot immediately relayed instructions to his wingman. Within moments, the interference cleared. The transponder of Flight 227 pinged correctly, confirming it was indeed a verified commercial aircraft. From the ground control station came the confirmation. "Raptor flight, stand down. Civilian airliner identified. Maintain visual escort until further notice." The tension melted from the cockpit of Flight 227 as the captain let out a long breath. "Colonel Mitchell," he said quietly, "you might have just saved us from being intercepted." Ava gave a modest smile. "Just old habits. They die hard." When she stepped back into the cabin, the passengers had no idea what had just happened. To them, the flight continued smoothly. But outside, the F-22s now maintained formation at a respectful distance, no longer on high alert but in protective escort. A silent salute to the woman who had once commanded their skies. Ava looked out the window, eyes glinting with nostalgia as she caught sight of the lead Raptor tipping its wings, a pilot's gesture of respect. She returned the salute with a small nod, her reflection faint in the glass. The salesman beside her leaned over. "Everything okay?" She smiled, a knowing softness in her gaze. "Everything's fine. Just a little turbulence." As the plane continued toward Washington, Ava Mitchell leaned back in her seat, the faintest smile on her lips. She had wanted a quiet life, anonymity, peace, but the sky had a way of finding her again. She closed her eyes, the low hum of engines blending with the memories of roaring afterburners, of missions long past, and the call sign that would forever be hers. Valkyrie. When Flight 227 finally landed in Washington, D.C., the cabin erupted with the usual flurry of activity, seatbelts clicking open, overhead bins slamming shut, passengers stretching their stiff limbs after hours in the air. To most aboard, it had been an uneventful flight. They had no idea how close they had come to triggering an aerial defense response, or that one woman among them had prevented it with nothing more than a calm voice and a lifetime of experience. But as Ava Mitchell stepped off the plane, she felt the weight of something different in the air, the unmistakable hum of recognition. Near the gate stood two men in suits with earpieces, their posture too disciplined to be ordinary airport staff. One of them stepped forward as she approached, his tone polite but firm. "Colonel Mitchell?" he asked quietly. Ava stopped, meeting his gaze. "Not anymore," she said evenly. "I'm retired." The man gave a faint smile. "Not today, ma'am. The Air Force would like a word." For a moment she considered brushing it off, walking past like an ordinary traveler, but something in his tone told her this wasn't a request. She sighed softly, adjusting the strap of her duffel. "Lead the way." They escorted her through a side corridor away from the flow of passengers. Her footsteps echoed against the polished floors, every sound amplified by the sterile silence of the restricted area. When they entered a small conference room overlooking the runway, Ava immediately recognized the man waiting inside, General Marcus Holbrook, her former commanding officer, and one of the few people who had ever dared to challenge her decisions. He was older now, gray at the temples, but his presence was as commanding as ever. "Valkyrie," he said with a half-smile as she entered. "I should have known only you could make a commercial flight turn into an air defense event." Ava chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I didn't plan on it, sir. Just happened to be in the wrong airspace at the right time." He gestured for her to sit. "That's what you always said before every impossible mission. Just happened to be there." They both smiled, though there was a shared understanding beneath it, the mutual recognition of what she'd done. "You saved that flight, Ava," Holbrook said seriously. "Those Raptors were seconds away from escalation protocol. You prevented a nightmare scenario." Ava leaned back, her tone calm. The signal interference was masking the transponder. It wasn't the pilot's fault. They did exactly what they were trained to do. Holbrook nodded. "Still, you saw what even our ground radar team missed. You always had that sixth sense." She looked away, out the window at the glimmering streaks of departing aircraft. "I've just been doing this long enough to recognize trouble before it starts." There was a pause. Then the general's voice softened. "You know, the pilots asked about you." She raised an eyebrow. "The Raptors?" "Yes, Lieutenant Reeve and his wingman. They couldn't believe it was really you. Apparently, your call sign still gets mentioned in training simulations." Ava smiled faintly, a mix of pride and nostalgia flickering in her eyes. They must have been desperate if they thought Valkyrie could fix it all from seat 12F. Holbrook laughed quietly. "Maybe, but they said you handled it with more composure than most on-duty officers. You made an impression." The door opened then, and in stepped two young pilots, one tall with sharp features, the other slightly shorter, his expression still brimming with awe. They snapped to attention instinctively, though Ava waved them off. "At ease, lieutenants," she said with a half-smile. Ma'am, said the taller one, Lieutenant Reeve, judging by the name tag on his flight suit. I just wanted to say, it's an honor to meet you in person. I've read your mission reports. The Falcon Ridge operation, that was you, wasn't it? Ava's expression softened. That was a long time ago. Yes, ma'am, he said, his excitement barely contained, but it's still taught at the academy. Your maneuver sequence in low-visibility combat is considered textbook perfection. The second pilot added, when we heard your voice come through the radio, we thought it was some kind of simulation glitch. We couldn't believe Valkyrie was actually speaking to us. Ava smiled humbly. Well, I'm glad my voice still gets some respect in your skies. Holbrook leaned forward, folding his hands. They've requested something, Ava. They want you to visit their base and give a guest session to the new Raptor wing. I know you're retired, but... She held up a hand. General, you know I left that life behind. I came here for the Veterans Foundation Conference, not for a reunion tour. I understand, he said gently. But maybe it's time you showed them what real leadership looks like again. The new generation looks up to you more than you realize. For a moment, silence filled the room. Ava's mind drifted, to the roaring engines, to the split-second decisions that used to define her existence, to the countless missions where lives depended on her judgment. Part of her missed it. The adrenaline, the purpose, the unity of flight. But another part remembered why she had left. The toll it took, the lives lost. The quiet nights haunted by radio silence after missions gone wrong. I'll think about it, she said finally. Holbrook nodded, satisfied. That's all I can ask. Later that evening, Ava found herself walking along the Potomac, the city lights glimmering against the water. The air was cool, carrying the faint sound of distant aircraft overhead. She looked up instinctively, her trained eyes finding the tiny silhouette of a jet gliding across the night sky. It stirred something deep within her. That sense of belonging to something vast and limitless. The sky had always been her home, no matter how far she tried to run from it. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. It read, Ma'am, this is Lieutenant Reeve. We'll be doing a training flight tomorrow at dawn near Andrews. If you happen to be awake, look east and we'll tip our wings for Valkyrie. Ava couldn't help but smile. It had been years since she'd felt that spark of pride, that connection to the new generation carrying her legacy forward. The next morning, before the city stirred, she stood by her hotel window, the horizon awash in shades of pink and gold, and just as promised, 3 silver streaks cut across the sky in perfect formation. As they passed, the lead jet banked sharply, its wings tilting toward the rising sun. A salute, Ava whispered softly. Good flying, boys. Her voice barely above a breath, but her peace was short-lived. A knock came at her door moments later. When she opened it, another Air Force officer stood waiting, his face serious. Colonel Mitchell, he said, holding out a sealed envelope. With orders from the Pentagon, she frowned. Orders? I'm retired, he nodded. Yes, ma'am. But the Secretary of Defense personally requested your consultation. They believe last night's incident with Flight 227 might have been more than signal interference. Intelligence suggests a deliberate cyber breach targeting both civilian and military navigation systems. Ava's expression hardened. You're saying someone spoofed both networks simultaneously? Yes, ma'am. And they think whoever did it wanted that airspace encounter to happen. A chill ran through her. The memory of the interference, the false readings, the jamming patterns. It all fit too perfectly. Someone had engineered it. But why? To test response times? To provoke conflict? Her mind began to race through possibilities, the calm, analytical precision of the old Valkyrie reawakening. She knew this wasn't over. What happened on that flight wasn't random. It was a message, and whoever sent it had just declared a new kind of war. Ava Mitchell sat in the quiet briefing room, the hum of fluorescent lights above her mingling with the low murmur of military personnel moving through the Pentagon hallways outside. The envelope from the previous morning lay open on the table before her, containing not just intelligence reports but a direct order. She was to assist in investigating the cyber breach that had targeted both civilian and military air navigation systems. Despite her retirement, despite the life she had painstakingly built for herself after leaving the Air Force, the message was clear, her expertise was needed, and no one else could handle this with the precision required. Ava exhaled slowly, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. The breach had been sophisticated, multi-layered, and audacious. exploiting weaknesses in both civilian transponders and military flight systems. If the perpetrators had succeeded fully, the consequences could have been catastrophic: misdirected aircraft, potential collisions, even a crisis that might have escalated into international tension. Her fingers traced the edge of the documents as she recalled Flight 227, the sudden interference, and the moment the F-22 pilots had awaited her call sign to verify the commercial plane's identity. What had seemed like a simple anomaly now revealed itself as part of a deliberate, sinister plan. Intelligence suggested that the breach was the work of a rogue group testing cyber warfare capabilities on live airspace, an unprecedented risk. Ava's mind, trained to parse complex variables and threats under pressure, began to map scenarios, anticipate the next moves of the unknown adversary. Each potential outcome needed contingencies. Every possibility had to be accounted for. Minutes later, she found herself walking through the secure Pentagon corridors alongside General Marcus Holbrook and a team of intelligence analysts. They were aware that calling her back into service after years of retirement was unusual, but her reputation as Valkyrie, one of the most brilliant strategic minds in the Air Force, made her uniquely qualified. Holbrook's voice broke her focus. "Ava, I know this isn't what you planned for your life now, but we need someone who can think like a pilot, like a commander, and see patterns others can't. You're the only one who fits that description." She nodded. "I understand, sir. Give me the data." The analysts handed her a tablet loaded with real-time flight telemetry, radar logs, and encrypted communication transcripts. The cyber breach was ongoing. Attempts to override signals were intermittent but precise. Someone was deliberately creating confusion, testing responses, and the patterns suggested a deep knowledge of both civilian and military navigation systems. Ava scanned the feeds quickly, her eyes flicking between multiple layers of data, calculating angles, velocities, and vectors simultaneously. Even the slight delay in transmissions told her volumes about the intruder's methodology. This wasn't a novice operation. This was the work of experts. Hours turned into a blur as Ava analyzed flight paths, cross-referenced pilot reports, and traced the intrusion patterns back to potential access points. Each discovery fed into her mental map of the operation. The more she unraveled, the clearer it became. The cyber attackers were not just testing systems. They were studying response protocols, simulating high-pressure scenarios to measure human and machine reaction under stress. And the attack on Flight 227, her flight, had been a deliberate trigger. A test to see if a civilian aircraft could be misidentified, and if escalation procedures would be invoked. Her thoughts flicked back to the cockpit moments, the adrenaline of verifying the transponder signal and calming the F-22 pilots. That split-second clarity and decisive action had likely prevented disaster. Now she realized they needed that same clarity again, this time in a controlled, strategic environment to uncover the perpetrators before the next test or attack could succeed. The next morning, Ava was escorted to an Air Force operations center, the room buzzing with activity. Screens displayed airspace overviews, radar sweeps, and maps marking the locations of every aircraft in U.S. skies. Analysts spoke in rapid-fire technical language, discussing anomalies, potential threats, and protocol deviations. Ava observed, absorbed, and began giving directives. She guided the team on how to triangulate the origin of the cyber interference, suggested redundancies for monitoring civilian flights, and developed contingency plans to prevent false transponder readings from triggering real-world defensive actions. Every suggestion was precise, every instruction delivered with calm authority that reminded everyone present why Valkyrie had earned her call sign. Hours later, as she monitored the skies, an alert flashed. A new unauthorized signal appeared over the northeast corridor. The pattern matched the previous breach, but the trajectory suggested something more aggressive. Ava's pulse quickened. This was not a simple test. Someone had escalated, attempting a direct compromise of multiple flight systems simultaneously. Her fingers flew over the console, coordinating fighter jet patrols, rerouting commercial aircraft, and countering the intrusions in real time. The room was tense, analysts glancing at each other nervously, but Ava's presence anchored them. Her voice, steady and commanding, cut through the chaos. "Monitor Vector Delta 3, maintain frequency 62.3. Keep civilian aircraft clear, but do not disengage until I confirm stabilization." As the hours stretched, Ava worked tirelessly, moving between consoles, adjusting strategies, and anticipating the intruder's next moves. Finally, after an intense cycle of tracking, analysis, and countermeasures, the unauthorized signals ceased. The breach contained. The team exhaled collectively, but Ava knew better than to relax completely. This operation had been only the beginning, a warning, a test, and now an invitation. Whoever orchestrated it had shown they were capable, intelligent, and bold. Holbrook approached her quietly. "You've done it. Systems are secure for now. But Ava, they know you're awake now. They'll be watching." Ava's eyes hardened. "Let them watch. I've been waiting for a reason to step back into the sky. Let's find out who's behind this before they get bolder." As she stepped back toward the operations floor, the enormity of what lay ahead sank in. She had retired to live a quiet, ordinary life, but the call of duty, the instinctive response that had saved Flight 227, had drawn her back into the storm. The sky was no longer just a canvas of freedom and serenity. It had become a battlefield of unseen threats, and Ava Mitchell, once Valkyrie, was the only person equipped to confront them. Outside, fighter jets streaked across the horizon, sunlight reflecting off their sleek fuselages. Ava watched them go, a quiet smile on her face, a renewed sense of purpose lighting her eyes. The woman in seat 12F was no longer just a passenger. She was back where she belonged, at the edge of danger, facing threats with precision, courage, and the unwavering calm that had defined her legend. The sky awaited, and Valkyrie was ready. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when Ava Mitchell stepped into the Mission Control Center, the glow of monitors reflecting across her determined face. Months of analysis, simulations, and intelligence briefings had brought her to this moment, the final confrontation with the mastermind behind the cyber attacks that had endangered Flight 227 and countless other aircraft. Every indicator, every intercepted signal, and every anomaly had led to a single location, a covert facility somewhere along the Northeast Corridor, operating with military-grade equipment and network access, sophisticated enough to mimic civilian and military air systems. Ava's pulse was steady, but her mind raced through the tactical possibilities. She was Valkyrie, and this mission demanded nothing less than the precision, strategy, and nerve that had earned her the reputation she now carried like armor. The operations room was tense. Analysts clustered around consoles, cross-checking satellite feeds, radar logs, and cyber intrusion patterns. Holbrook approached, his expression a mix of respect and urgency. "Ava, you've led us here. This is the final step. Are you ready?" Ava nodded, scanning the screens that mapped the target facility. "I've never been more ready. We go in calculated, fast, and precise. No surprises. They'll never anticipate this." The team initiated a multi-layered strategy: cyber countermeasures to lock down communications, electronic surveillance to track the intruder's movements, and coordination with Air Force Special Operations units to prepare a physical interception if needed. Ava monitored everything, her hands moving deftly across consoles, adjusting frequencies, rerouting signals, and creating decoys to flush out the perpetrators. The facility responded almost immediately, triggering automated defenses, but Ava anticipated every move. Her decades of experience translating situational awareness into actionable decisions gave her an edge no one else possessed. Hours passed in high-intensity synchronization. Ava directed drones to probe the perimeter, fighter jets to maintain aerial coverage, and cyber units to simulate vulnerabilities designed to lure the hackers into revealing themselves. And then, just as the sun reached its zenith, the breakthrough arrived. A signal spike indicated unauthorized logins to multiple military and civilian systems, originating from a single secure node inside the facility. Ava recognized the signature immediately. Highly skilled, methodical, and familiar. It wasn't just a random hacker or rogue operator. This was someone who had studied military protocols, perhaps someone who had trained within the system itself. "Sir," Ava said calmly, pointing at the display, "we have a live trace. The main operator is on site, executing multiple vectors simultaneously. This is the person responsible for the Flight 227 interference." Holbrook leaned in. "How fast can we contain it?" "Fast enough," she replied. "We're going to neutralize the cyber threat and the physical threat simultaneously." Ava coordinated with the Special Operations team, providing precise instructions based on her intimate understanding of both aerial and terrestrial tactics. The plan was flawless. They would isolate the cyber operators with electronic countermeasures while the ground unit would move in under her guidance. Every movement was synchronized, every calculation precise. The hackers had underestimated the woman they thought was long retired, the quiet passenger who had been asleep in seat 12F, and they were about to pay the price for that misjudgment. As the assault team approached the facility, Ava's voice came over their comms. Team Alpha, breach the eastern access point. Team Bravo, hold perimeter at grid 7. Drones are in position to disable any automated defenses. Proceed on my mark. Seconds stretched like minutes as the operation unfolded. Ava's eyes scanned every feed, every camera, every signal, tracking the adversary's movements in real time. Inside the facility, the hackers were confident, unaware that someone of unparalleled experience had already anticipated their strategy. When they attempted to override their own system, the countermeasures Ava had deployed neutralized the intrusion instantly, leaving them exposed. On the ground, the Special Operations Unit stormed the facility. Ava's guidance from the control center was surgical, directing each agent to disable communications, secure servers, and detain personnel without triggering collateral damage. The hackers were skilled, but not Valkyrie skilled. One by one, they were apprehended, their networks isolated, their plans dismantled in real time. Finally, Ava focused on the primary operator, a figure cloaked in the glow of multiple monitors, panicked at the sudden lockdown. Ava's voice cut through the system, calm and authoritative. Step away from the console. You're compromised. Surrender immediately. The figure froze, realizing their options had evaporated. It took seconds for the reality to sink in. The legendary Valkyrie, long thought retired, had orchestrated their downfall from the shadows, anticipating every move they had made. Defiance crumbled, and the hacker finally complied, raising hands in surrender as the ground team secured the room. With the facility neutralized, Ava leaned back slightly, allowing herself the faintest smile. The immediate threat had been contained, lives were safe, and the Air Force's credibility remained intact. But more than that, she had proved something to herself. That despite the years away from active duty, her skills, instincts, and calm under pressure had not dulled. As the operation concluded, Holbrook approached. Ava, you've done it. Flight 227 is safe, and more importantly, you've prevented a potential catastrophe on a scale we can barely comprehend. The Air Force owes you everything. She shook her head modestly. I just did what needed to be done. I was in the right place at the right time. Again. Outside, the sunlight glinted off the returning F-22 Raptors, their pilots giving a silent, sharp salute in recognition of the woman who had once commanded the skies and now commanded the safety of thousands on the ground. Ava watched them, a mixture of nostalgia and pride flooding through her. She had left the cockpit years ago seeking peace, anonymity, and ordinary life. Yet fate, it seemed, had other plans. The world would never know the quiet hero who had been asleep in C-12F until her call sign brought a squadron to attention, until her calm decisiveness prevented disaster midair, until her strategy dismantled a cyber operation designed to endanger countless lives. But Ava didn't need the recognition. Her satisfaction lay in the knowledge that her actions had mattered, that she had protected people who would never even know her name. As she stepped out of the facility and breathed in the crisp, open air, Ava Mitchell felt the familiar pull of the sky, the thrill of strategy, and the quiet pride of a woman who had been called to duty, and had answered it flawlessly. Valkyrie, once a legend of the air, had returned not for glory but for the mission, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had long known. The sky had never truly released her, and perhaps it never would. She gazed up at the open expanse above, sunlight glinting off the jets performing a flyover in perfect formation, and whispered with a smile, always ready, always vigilant. The mission was over. The threat neutralized, and the woman in seat 12F, the retired colonel, the legendary Valkyrie, had reminded the world that true heroes could emerge in the quietest of moments, even when no one was watching.